What we've been talking about in this series is the fact that you can call yourself a Christian and believe just about anything you want to believe. Like really, like you can say, yes, I'm a Christian, and believe just about anything you want to believe and do just about anything you want to do. And if somebody challenges you on that, you can just be like, no, I'm a Christian. I believe stuff. And the reason you can do that is because the word Christian isn't really defined in the Bible. In fact, the word Christian is only found 3 times in all of the Bible. You think about how thick the Bible is. Many of you have probably never even read through it, but, the whole thing because it's so big. And you think about how many words are in there. The word Christian in all those pages is only found 3 times. And all 3 times it's being used by outsiders to describe this group of Jesus followers, people who didn't follow Jesus, looking at these people who were following Jesus and who all kind of believed the same stuff and all were following the same person. And they said, oh, those Christians. And the name just kind of stuck. Over time, eventually the Christians started saying, yeah, you know what? I'm not ashamed to be called that. I'll die for that name. It's okay. I don't care what you call me. But when you look at what Jesus actually called his disciples, he called them something different. He called them disciples. Yeah, I gave it away. There it was. He called them disciples, okay? When he defined what they were, he said, you are my disciples. And that word is kind of terrifying because it is so well defined in Scripture. That word is clearly defined, narrowly defined. It's a very narrow, technical kind of term that Jesus used to describe his followers. And this is why, as we've said before, on every single issue, be it political or financial or family issues or international issues, even war, like almost every war down throughout history, you've had Christians on both sides of it. And people on both sides have said, yes, we're Christians. How can they disagree so much and still call themselves the same thing? I think it's because you can define Christian any way you want to define it. And you can find justification for calling yourself a Christian anywhere you want to define, any place you want to, in any way that you want to define it. That's why in the history of our country, during the Civil War, you had Christians fighting for the North and the South. There were Christians in this country fighting for slavery, and there were Christians fighting against slavery. Now, how could there be such a huge dichotomy there? How could there be such a huge separation? Shouldn't all Christians be on the side of freedom and equality? Wouldn't you think? But no, there were Christians on both sides. But now when you look at the New Testament and you really open up your Bible and you look at what Jesus called his followers and you ask the question, what does it really look like to follow Jesus? Not just to be a Christian in name. What does it look like to follow Jesus? It is terrifyingly clear. It's clear as day. In fact, Jesus said, if you don't get anything else, he said, if you don't get anything else, here's the one thing that should describe you. Do you remember what he said? The night before he left the earth, he got his closest followers together, and he said, guys, if you don't remember anything else I've said or done, remember this one thing. He said, by this one thing, everyone will know that you're my disciples if you love one another. See, yeah, some of you guys have been paying attention. Thank you. Thank you. That makes me feel good. Thank you for paying attention. Yes, he said, by this one thing, people will know that you're my disciples, right? There's the word again. If you love one another. He said, it's not your gold cross necklace that you wear. Nothing again. I'm not slamming anybody if you're wearing a gold cross necklace this morning. But that's not what defines you as a follower of Jesus. It's not your bumper sticker, right? It's not your political affiliation. Can we just say that? It's not your political affiliation. All right? It's not your political affiliation that defines if you're a follower of Jesus. It's not the kind of family you were born into. It's not even if you were baptized, as important as that is. The one thing, Jesus said, the one thing that defines you as my follower, he said, here's how they're going to know that you follow me. It's by how you love one another. And then he said, I want you, and this is where it gets hairy. He said, I want you to love the way I love. Now, that's pretty much the problem, isn't it? He said, I want you to love the way I love. And that's the problem, because all of us think we know something about love, and we do. We've all had different experiences. We've all experienced love to some degree and to different extents. But Jesus said, okay, people are going to know you're my followers by the way you love each other, and I want you to love each other the way I have loved you. And right here's the problem. When you open up the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and you look at the way that Jesus loved people, in some ways it's kind of like the call to follow him. In some ways, when you look at the way that Jesus loved and you look at and you say, I've got to do that, that's terrifying. It's terrifying to love the way Jesus loved. Because when you look at the way that Jesus loved, like when you really dig into your Bible and you look at it, it seems kind of inconsistent at times. When you look at the way Jesus loved, there's this tension. There's this tension here, this tension that we all kind of want to resolve. In fact, it's a tension that we're so uncomfortable with because many of us went to churches or we were raised in churches where we were kind of on one side or the other of this tension. Okay, and regardless of where you went to church, it's not that you didn't necessarily believe what was being taught. You know, whatever the preacher said, it's not that you didn't believe what he said, but maybe you felt like there was something missing. And the reason is maybe there was something missing. Because when you open up the New Testament and you ask, how did Jesus love? Here's what you discover, that the way Jesus loved was messy. Like it seems inconsistent, seemingly unfair. Sometimes when you read the way Jesus loved people and you look at it, you're like, that's not fair, Jesus. You love them too much. Like they should have got what was coming to them. Why do you keep loving them? And the temptation, and he tells us to love like that, right? He tells us to love like that. And the tension here is between grace and truth. And we're tempted to want to resolve it. And if you don't hear anything else today, I want you to hear this. If you try to resolve the tension that's created around Jesus' love, you lose something. You lose something important. You give up something very, very important. And yet we're tempted to do it all the time. So here's the deal. Personally and individually, we're tempted to resolve that tension. But if you try to resolve it, you give up something so important. And this is what drove people crazy about Jesus. This is why people couldn't stand Jesus. But he was comfortable with it, and he ministered through it. And guys, for us, we dare not walk away from that tension. We dare not try to walk away from it, even though it's messy, even though it's inconsistent, even though at times it's confusing, and it'll make people wonder, what are they really about, those Christians? What do they really believe? Now, John, one of Jesus' original disciples, who wrote, you think about the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. He wrote the Gospel of John, and then he wrote some letters to the other churches. It was 1 John, 2 John, 3 John. You might know those letters. As we've talked about before, he got to be an old man. Okay, he grew old. Matthew, we think, was beheaded. The Apostle Paul Matthew was burned at the stake. The Apostle Paul was beheaded. Peter was crucified upside down, but somehow John survived. He made it into old age, and about 40 or 50 years after Jesus left the earth, John is an old man, and he's kind of sitting around, and I guess maybe some of the disciples came to him and said, John, you really ought to think about writing this stuff down. You ought to think about writing some of your experiences with Jesus down, because he hadn't written it down to that point. When Jesus said that he was coming back, he ascended back into heaven and said, "Lo, I come quickly," they thought he meant like next Thursday. The original disciples thought he meant like next week. They thought, okay, he's going to go up, get some angel armies, and come back. But John, 40 or 50 years later now, is an old man, and the disciples were like, you know what, John, it doesn't look like Jesus is going to come back in your lifetime. Maybe you ought to think about writing this down. And so that's what he did. He sat down as an old man, and he begins to write out the Gospel of John. He sits down, and he's seen things, right? He's seen some messed up stuff. He's seen bloodshed. He's seen sorrow. He's seen death. And he sits down to write his gospel. And what he does is he begins his account of the life of Jesus. If you know John chapter 1, he paints this picture of God sending Jesus as the Word. It says, what John 1:1 says? It says, "Now the Word was God, and the Word was with God." And he says that Word was sent from God into the world, and the Word became flesh, and He was human, and He walked among us, and He ate with us, and He lived with us. And John paints this beautiful picture of like Jesus being an artist who paints a picture on a canvas and then somehow miraculously enters the canvas and begins to walk around with all the people that He's painted. But then the people that He's painted don't recognize Him as the artist, and they kick Him out. It's a powerful picture, right? And that's how John describes Jesus coming into the world. And then in the opening section of this gospel, this incredible piece of literature, the Gospel of John, he gives us the terminology. He gives us the words that best capture this tension of the way Jesus loved. This tension that you are going to bump into at some point if you follow Jesus. You're going to bump into this and you're going to be tempted to resolve it, but we cannot resolve it. This is what makes being a follower of Jesus hard and messy and inconsistent. But if you try to resolve it, you leave something out. And here are the words he left us with. If you have your Bibles, John chapter 1, verse 14. It'll be up here on the screen too. He says, "The Word became flesh and made His dwelling among us." And there's this great imagery in this word, right? In these words, He made His dwelling among us, that God moved into the neighborhood. In other words, that Jesus came down and He lived with us. And when John writes this, he's not talking about you and me 2,000 years later. Like, this is something that John himself experienced. This was his life story. He said, I saw God come into the world, and I saw God eat with us and drink with us and laugh with us and cry with us. And he's like, I have seen something that you haven't seen. I've seen something that you just had to be there to understand. He said, I've seen something, and I just wish I could capture it for you. And so he writes this phrase in verse 14. He says, we have seen His glory, the glory of the one and only Son who came from the Father, full of grace and truth. Right there it is. There's the tension. Full to the brim of grace and truth. Now, you know what grace is, and you know what truth is. Grace is what is like, hey, you're forgiven. Truth is what says, hey, you're accountable. Grace is what says, hey, you're fine. Truth is what says, no, you're broken. Grace is what says you're going to be okay. Truth is what says you need to work on it. Grace is what says, no matter what you do, I love you. Truth is what says, yes, but you're still accountable to a standard. So there's this tension between grace and truth. And you know what? All of us, through our different personalities or our different upbringings or our different religious backgrounds, whatever it might be, we all lean one way or the other, I think. I think all of us kind of lean towards truth or we lean towards grace, just kind of naturally. And so that's where the tension comes in. Some of you were brought up with parents where one of them was grace and the other one was truth. You know what I'm saying? And which one did you like better? You liked grace better. Of course you did. Well, Grace is sitting right here. Her name is literally Grace. She's like, yes, of course, everyone loves Grace. But not the kind of grace I'm talking about, though, although everyone does love you. But if you grew up in a great home, you had doses of both, right? Grace and truth. It wasn't just all one-sided. And here's what John said. He said, this is remarkable. He said, I spent years of my life watching Jesus. I spent years of my life watching this guy navigate some of the most unbelievable circumstances you can imagine, some of the most difficult circumstances you can imagine. And as I begin my gospel, as I begin my description of what it was like to be with Jesus, here's what I saw, that He was absolutely full of grace and truth. Now, you see, I want it to be one or the other. Like, if this represents grace and this represents truth, I want it to be one or the other. I want to lean like this way, or I want to lean this way. But John says Jesus, God in the flesh, was full of both. So it's like, and actually the wording would have us to say that He was full to the brim and overflowing with grace and truth. And then John goes on to say that out of His fullness, do you see this next verse? Out of His fullness We have all received grace upon grace, just overflowing into our lives because he was full of grace and truth. He wasn't just one or the other. There was no balance between grace and truth. He was full of both. And out of his fullness, we have received the overflow. We have received the fullness of grace and truth, which literally means we've received grace upon grace upon grace upon grace, that he poured the pitcher full, and out of the overflow, we have received his grace and his truth. And then John brings us to this point of clarification in verse 17. He says in verse 17, for the law, now we know what the law is, right? That's the 10 Commandments, the law of Moses, all the other 600 commandments in the Old Testament. But he says, for the law was given, and this is an important word, given through Moses. And we've seen the movie, right? We've seen Charlton Heston come down from the mountain, his stone tablets in hand. We know that, right? We know what that looks like. The law was given through Moses, the law that tells us what to do and what not to do and how to make it right, the law that says thou shalt not, and thou shalt not, and thou shalt really not, and when thou doest, go to the temple and sacrifice an animal and make restitution for your sin, right? We know that. He said the law was given through Moses. And then there's this huge distinction in the very next phrase. And I think maybe John had to pause a second while he's writing this. I think maybe he had to pause and think about it just to be like, how do I capture this? He says the law was given through Moses, but grace and truth came, and he doesn't use the word given. He says grace and truth came. It was a different word. The word literally means begotten or born. Okay, grace and truth were born. It showed up in the full package through Jesus Christ. Not the balance between grace and truth. That's where we want to try to balance these things. Not a balance of it, the embodiment of it. The embodiment of all of it. The fullness of the grace of God and the fullness of the truth of God made flesh in Jesus Christ. And this right here is what made Jesus so messy. When you read the Gospels, this is what made Jesus so confusing. This is what made Jesus so unpredictable. Like when you read it, he's kind of unpredictable, isn't he? And this is why everybody hated him. And John said, no, he wasn't just the balance of the two, he was all of it. He was all of it. And he brought all of it to bear on every individual he interacted with. He brought it all to bear into every single situation. And just when we, the disciples, thought he was going to go one way, he went the other way. And just when we thought he was going to go this way, he went that way. And if you read the Gospels through this lens, you see it all the time. And in fact, I would just challenge all of you to read back through Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John like this summer. Let that be kind of your summer project. Read back through the Gospels with this in mind because you see it over and over and over again. One day he shows up, and if you grew up in Sunday school, you know the story. He shows up at a well, and there's just a Samaritan woman there, and they're just alone together. And Jewish people didn't commingle with Samaritans. They hated Samaritans, considered them half-breeds. And here's this Jewish man even talking to this Samaritan woman, which was a whole nother level of, supposed prejudice. Jesus walks up to her and he begins just talking to her like a human being. That is grace. Even the woman was like, what are you doing? Why are you talking to me? That's grace. He talked to her. She's just amazed that this guy is talking to her. She's like, what's up with this guy? And Jesus says, hey, you know what? I just want a drink of water. Could you get me a drink of water, please? And so she does. And then he says, you know what? Why don't you go back into town and get your husband and bring him out here? And you remember what she said? She said, actually, sir, I have no husband. And you knew what Jesus does then? So grace, right? Grace. But then all of a sudden he says, I know you have no husband. In fact, you've had 5. And the man you're living with right now is not your husband. He reaches into the most painful, shameful part of her life and exposes it. He says, you've had 5 husbands, you've divorced them all, or they're all dead. Either way, you've done a horrible job as a woman when it comes to men. You are not good with men. To which we want to say, like, I read that and I'm like, whoa, hey, Jesus, didn't you go to seminary? Like, you don't do that, right? You don't bring up the bad stuff. You just focus on the good stuff, right? You don't bring up the shame in somebody's past. You're supposed to just help them get past it. Where's the grace? But then you know what Jesus does next, right? Do you remember this part? We see him do something in this story that he doesn't do anywhere else in all the Bible. This Samaritan woman, he's just exposed her past. She's probably embarrassed that he knows this. She's in awe that he knows this. And Jesus, I just imagine he kind of looks around and says, hey, guess who I am? In the midst of her pain and her shame, he's eyeball to eyeball with the Samaritan woman, and he says, guess who I am. Do you remember this? Do you remember this? He says, I'm the Messiah. I'm the Son of God, and I can give you water that will quench the thirst of your soul in a way that no man ever could. And so she leaves, and she runs back into town telling everybody what's happened. She's like, there's a man who's told me everything I ever done. I've just met the Messiah. That is grace and truth. That is grace and truth. Or think about Matthew, one of the original disciples. Matthew was a tax collector, and everybody hated tax collectors in Jesus' day. I mean, if you think that they have bad reputations now, the people who call you up with your credit cards or whatever, these people were even worse. Like, they were considered traitors to the Jewish people. And Jesus says to Matthew, while he's out tax collecting, Jesus says, hey, I want you to follow me. I want you to be one of my guys. I want you to be one of my disciples. And he does. And all the other disciples have to be thinking, what? Jesus, don't you care about our reputation? Like, when people see a tax collector with us, they're going to think that we approve of tax collecting. Don't you care about what people think about us? And I just imagine Jesus is like, yeah, it's going to get worse. Just wait. It's going to get worse. All right, because at about 6 o'clock this evening, he didn't have a wristwatch, but about 6 o'clock this evening, we're going to have a party at Matthew's house, and we're going to invite all the sinners and the tax collectors to come, and we're going to eat and drink with them and be merry. And the disciples had to be like, oh, what are you doing? Don't you care about our reputation? Don't you care? Jesus would say, what do you think I'm here for? I don't care about my reputation. The Son of Man has come to seek and save the lost. I'm not here to guard our reputation. Grace and truth. And if you grew up in Sunday school, you might know that when he was crucified, when Jesus was crucified on the cross, he was crucified between 2 thieves. But they weren't really thieves because they didn't crucify thieves. They crucified the worst of the worst. Like, they crucified the people who couldn't even be trusted in a Roman prison. They crucified the people who couldn't even be trusted to row in the galley on a Roman ship. These were the worst of the worst, and they crucified Jesus between these 2 guys. And if you know the story, one of them says to Jesus, hey, you know what, you're innocent, but we're just getting what we deserve. Now, we would expect Jesus, meek and humble Jesus, to be like, no, you're a good person. Don't get down on yourself. He doesn't say anything like that, right? And in essence, he's like, yeah, no argument there. You're a pretty awful person, but today, you will be with me in paradise. Today, best of the best, worst of the worst, we will be together in paradise. Grace and truth. Now, when you read the Bible, this is what's so confusing, because just a couple of chapters before that, there's this rich young ruler who comes to Jesus. This rich young man who had kept all the commandments. He was an upstanding citizen. He even told Jesus, I have kept all the commandments since my youth. What must I do to be your disciple? And what does Jesus tell him? Do you remember? He says, good for you. You've kept all the commandments, but this one thing you lack. Go and sell everything you have to the poor, and then you can come follow me. And the Bible says the young man went away sad because he had many possessions. But this guy on the cross gets in with like a second left on the clock. What's up with that, right? That's inconsistent. That seems confusing. This guy who's been a good person all his life comes to Jesus and says, I want to follow you. And Jesus says, go sell everything you have first, then you can follow me. But this worst of the worst guy hanging beside him on the cross gets in with a second left. What's up with that? What is up with that? And then, And I mean, what I'm saying is that if you try to resolve that tension, you lose something. If you try to figure that all out and try to rationalize Jesus, you lose something. I mean, here's this completely meaningless, last-minute plea of mercy, and Jesus says, today, you're going to be with me in paradise. Boom, there it is. There's the tension again. There's the tension. And I'm just telling you, all throughout the Gospels, you see it. And if you try to resolve it, you lose something. And then maybe the most famous story of all is actually in the Gospel of John. It's about a woman who's caught in adultery. And the religious people bring her and they throw her down at the feet of Jesus in the dirt. And they say, Jesus, this woman was caught in adultery. The law of Moses, right, the law that was given through Moses says that she should be stoned to death. Now, Jesus could have finagled his way out of that. Jesus could have been like, oh, well, but the law of Rome says that we can't do that. According to Roman law, we can't do that. So just kind of, let's turn it over to the Roman courts. But Jesus doesn't do that. Do you remember what he does? He says, okay, he says, I accept that truth. I accept that this is what the law of Moses says. But I tell you what, you who are without sin, you cast the first stone. You who have always kept the law of Moses, you who have always kept the spirit of the law of Moses, you cast the first stone. You who have never committed adultery, you who have never looked at a woman lustfully, those of you who have always kept the law of Moses to every T, you throw the first stone. And what happened? They all walked away. You'd almost like hear the sound of their stones thudding in the dirt as they turn and walk away. Jesus says, let's play to Moses' law. Who's kept it? And then as Jesus is alone with the woman afterwards, she probably won't even look at him, right? She's probably still looking into the dirt, just her hair covering her face, weeping. And Jesus is left alone with her. And he says, woman, where are your accusers? And she says, there are none, Lord. And what does Jesus tell her? He says, neither do I condemn you. Now go and sin no more. Which is it? There's the tension again. Is it neither do I condemn you, or is it go and sin no more? Right? Is it I don't condemn you, or you're a sinner? Yes. Yes. I don't condemn you. Now go leave your life of sin. Did you have to bring up the sin part, Jesus? Yes. Yes, grace and truth. Why did you have to bring up the sin part when you already told her that she wasn't condemned? Because this is how I love. I am the embodiment of grace and truth. And I mean, we could go on and on, man. We could go on and on with this stuff all throughout the Bible. And you know, as a church, we try to do this right. We try to get this right, and we don't always get it right because the church is full of imperfect people, right? And imperfect people, I mean, we kind of do imperfect things from time to time. But I mean, when we find ourselves in difficult situations, I believe that, you know, we've got to just, we can't be just a grace church or just a truth church. We have to try to live them both out as good as we can. Because it would be easy to be one or the other. It would be easy to be over on one side and say, oh, no sin matters. We're just all about grace, and we're not going to call sin sin. Or we could be on the other side and just be like, we're going to be all about truth, and we hate people, and we're just going to tell them that they're sinners and kick them to hell, right? We could totally do either one. We could totally go to either side, and it would be easy. It would be easy to do that. Like in the churches that I was raised in, we were truth churches. You know what I mean? We were very much on the side of truth, and I'm prone to that. If I can just be honest with you guys, I'm prone to that, like, because I'm a good talker, and I teach the Bible, you know. I can just totally, I can make you feel good, I can make you feel bad, I can inspire you, I can beat you over the head with the Bible and just make you feel awful about yourself. But you know what? When I'm the one in trouble, I like the grace part. Love the grace part when I'm the one who's done something wrong. Love the grace part when I'm the one who's sinned, when I'm the one who's been sinning. So we're conflicted. Do you see this? Like it's a conflict. You're trying to figure this out, and this is messy. And I'll just say this. If you want to know what Jesus meant by what he said, look at what he did. If you want to know what Jesus meant by what he said, look at what he did. If you want to know what Jesus meant when he said, love one another, then you just watch how Jesus loved. Do you know how Jesus loved? He called sin, sin, and then he paid for it. He called sin, sin, and then he himself paid for it. And having paid for it, he declared, I do not condemn you. And then he says to all of us, because I have not condemned you, go and sin no more. Leave your life of sin. And if you don't, I love you. And if you feel like you can't get out of it, I love you. And if you've been wounded so much that you feel like you're just in this downward spiral of depression and sin, and you feel like you'll never get out of it, I love you. And if somebody else has hurt you so badly that you feel like you can never forgive them, and it's just sent your life into this pit of hell and the pit of despair, and you just feel like you'll never get over it, I love you. And the truth is that you are a sinner. But the grace is that I don't condemn you. And no one will ever love you more. And I couldn't love you anymore, even myself. But now for us who are trying to live that out, there's a tension, right? I mean, there is a huge tension there. Jesus says, I want you to love like that. As I have loved you, so you are to love. As I have loved you, so you are to love. So there's a tension here that if you ever try to resolve or go to one side or the other, you lose something incredibly important. Do you know why we can't let go of truth? We can't let go of truth because every sin has a consequence and people need to know. Every sin has like a gotcha, right? Sin, and God doesn't want your sin to get you. Okay? And so we can't let go of the truth. So every once in a while, and not just every once in a while, like constantly, God says, here's how you live. Here's how you live. Here's the standard. Here's what you do with your money. Here's what you do with your ethics. Here's what you do with your sexuality. Here's how you treat people. Here's how you treat your kids. Here's how you treat your parents. Here's why you confess. Here's why you're accountable. Because sin has a gotcha, and I don't want it to get you. So you can't let go of the truth. And the reason you can't let go of grace is because to a certain extent, sin already got us. Sin already got us. It's already got you. And grace is your only way back. Grace is your only way to ever know that you've connected or reconnected with your Heavenly Father. And so you need truth and you need grace. And Jesus is the embodiment of it all. And if Jesus, now here's where it gets personal, if Jesus is the embodiment of grace and truth, and the church is his body, if Jesus is the embodiment of grace and truth, and the church is his body, we're his hands and his feet, then we, you and I, are the best expression of Jesus anyone will ever know. You and I are the best expression of Jesus anyone will ever know. Just let that sink into your spirit today. You are the best expression of Jesus anyone in your life will ever know. So then we have to be comfortable with the mess. We've got to be comfortable with the tension. We've got to be comfortable with the unfairness and the inconsistency and all the stuff that goes along with managing and hanging on to that tension of grace and truth. And here's what I'm convinced of. I'm convinced that the church is at its best. The church is at its best when it embraces grace and truth and refuses to let go of either one. If you want to know what Jesus meant by what he said, look at how he lived, and here it is. If you want to know what Jesus meant when he said, love one another, here it is. It's messy, and it's difficult. And we don't know what to do with that tension a lot of times. We don't know how to handle it, but we dare not let go of either. Because there will come a time in each of our lives There already has been times, and there will be times in the future where every one of us will need massive doses of truth and grace. And the church, you and I, we're to be the dispensers of both. So let's be a church. Let's just commit to being a church that's all about the grace of God, and a church that is all about the truth of God. And let's not let go of either. And let's continue to pray that God will help us to manage the tension, because it's hard. It's not easy. But let's pray that God will help us to manage the tension to His glory, so that people from every walk of life will know that God has said to them, yes, you have sinned, and I've paid for it, and you are not condemned, and I love you. And if you don't get that reading the words in the Bible, maybe you'll get it through my people. Maybe you'll get it through my people, and maybe, just maybe, grace and truth will be lived out in their lives in such a redemptive way that your life will be changed forever. But there will forever and always be this tension. So let's be that unique group of people who refuses to let go of either. So here's the big question for you today as we get ready to close. Who do you need to show this kind of love to this week? You probably already know. There's probably somebody on your nerves. There's probably somebody that you know needs grace and truth. Are you willing to get messy? Are you willing to get messy? Because I'm just telling you, if you let go of this, if you try to figure it out, if you try to resolve this, you lose something. You lose something incredibly important. What you lose is the gospel. So would you stand with me today? I want to pray for you guys.